Okay, so in the last video, we were talking about cowardice and, or I'm sorry, selfishness and courage. So my last question was, in selfishness, some sort of cowardice. And I think that what this does is it introduces another theme in the book of courage. And so I wanted to include just a few of the quotes that I think really apply to this idea. So Samuel Johnson said, "Courage is a quality so necessary for maintaining virtue that it is always respected, even when it is associated with vice." Now, if courage is something that you like to talk about in your paper, then I would recommend that you really revisit this quote. I think there's a lot to be said here for courage. I wanted to show you here what the Sorting Hat said on page 121 about Harry. Said a small voice in his ear. Difficult, very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes. And a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. So where shall I put you? And Harry gripped the edges of the stool and thought, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, eh? Said the small voice. Are you sure? You could be great, you know. It's all here in your head. And Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness, no doubt about that. No? Well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor. Right? Okay. So, so that's my little reading of that. But that's how that goes. That's so Harry just doesn't want to be Slytherin because when he meets Draco Malfoy, he represents the Dursleys and the world that he experienced with the Dursleys. He does not want to be like that, and he does not want to live in Draco's shadow. And so he wants to make sure that he can prove himself in a place that he can make all his own. And for him, that's Gryffindor. Also on the page 121, and a nice thirst to prove yourself. That's what I meant about Harry struggling with, personal power, success, and failure, because he does want to prove himself in this new world. He does want to be who he's always meant to be. He wants to learn exactly what that is. A Gryffindor rather die than betray his friends. Okay, so we're talking the type of courage that we would all aspire to. We're talking about the type of courage that we would all like to have and exude in our everyday lives. And that's Gryffindor, and it's rare. It's a rare thing. So it's really important that we're then able to, to see Harry grow into that. And we get a little foreshadowing here in chapter 7 on page 130. Harry sees Professor Quirrell. Okay. Now, first of all, I just love the fact that she names him Quirrell because it sounds like quarrel and squirrel put together, right? And I think that is very fitting here because he will be the root of a quarrel with Harry in this first installment, but also Squirrel, his name Quirrell, sounding like squirrel almost, makes us know and helps us know that he really is no match for Harry and that he's a squirrelish character. And we're going to see that very plainly in this book. So on page 130, it says, perhaps Harry had eaten a bit too much because he had a very strange dream. Now this is foreshadowing. He was wearing Professor Quirrell's turban, which kept talking to him, telling him he must transfer to Slytherin at once because it was his destiny. So the question here is for you, who's really talking to him? Is it just a dream, number one? Is it the turban that's talking to him, or is it something else representing the turban that's talking to him? Now, remember his scar on his forehead. That's all I'm going to say. Harry told the turban he didn't want to be in Slytherin. It got heavier and heavier, and when he tried to pull it off, it tightened painfully, and there was Malfoy laughing at him as he struggled with it. And then Malfoy turned into the hook-nosed teacher Snape, whose laugh became high and cold. There was a burst of green light, and Harry woke, sweating and shaking. Okay, so lots going on here. This is I usually don't like dream sequences in fiction, usually because they're not done very well. This one little paragraph is written with immense brilliance, right? It's a stroke of genius because it tells us everything we need to know about these characters before we can put it all into perspective, right? But it's just something to kind of put in the back of our minds, let it simmer on the back burner. So the idea of greatness is twofold here. Because Gryffindor is just as capable as Slytherin, and that's important to note here, right? Because he says, wow, you could be Gryffindor or Slytherin. Well, if you want to be successful, if successful is what you want to be the most, then you should go to Slytherin. But if you're going to embark on a journey that requires you to use your courage more than attain your own personal success, if you will put your friends above all else, then you should be Gryffindor. And that's why Harry ends up being Gryffindor. It's a conscious choice, and that's important because it's the Sorting Hat essentially leaves it up to Harry to decide. This is notable. Just as Gryffindor is as capable as a Slytherin, good magic and dark magic are two sides of the same coin, and whichever you choose is a choice. It's a choice. It cannot be forced upon you, and that's why we have Professor Quirrell's name being what it is, to show that he's a very squirrelish, cowardly-like character. There's no way in heck he is Gryffindor, and there's no way in heck he's Slytherin either, because he's too weak. And so this is really notable. This leads into, I think, one of the many lessons of this text, that children have important decisions to make about who they want to be in this world. Very important. I'm going to read something to you on the bottom of page 134. Harry was very relieved to find out that he wasn't miles behind everyone else. Lots of people had come from Muggle families, and like him, hadn't had any idea that they were witches and wizards. Page 135. There was so much to learn that even people like Ron didn't have much of a head start. So Hogwarts is like the great leveler, right? No matter how much magic you think you know, how much of an advantage you think you have, because you were raised by a witch and a wizard at home, really doesn't account for much, because in the real world, you're not supposed to be using magic anyway, right? Especially those who are not licensed to use it, meaning those that have not attained a proper education on it. And so this is a really important point here. It shows that everything that Harry does in Hogwarts, everything that he accomplishes, will be all his own. And there's another reminder here of intimidation on page 137. Professor Snape keeps calling on Harry. Hermione has her hand raised because she knows the answer, and Snape is grilling Harry, and he says, let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? And Hermione stretched her hand as high into the air as it would go without her leaving her seat, but Harry didn't have the faintest idea what a bezoar was. He tried not to look at Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were shaking with laughter. I don't know, sir. Thought you wouldn't open a book before coming, eh, Potter? And Hermione, not being able to take it, stood up, stretching her hand high in the air because she knows the answer. And Harry says, I don't know, quietly. I think Hermione does, though. Why don't you try her? Right? And this makes Snape furious. Now, why is he so hard on Harry here? And I think that the point here is that he's letting the class know, because Harry is famous in this magical world. Everybody knows who Harry Potter is. To be in class with Harry Potter, I mean, goodness. So Snape is trying to make a point, and he's using Harry as an example to make this point, that nobody is special, everybody's starting from ground zero, and that you are a product of your own making and your own effort and drive. And it has nothing to do with your name, what your last name is, who your parents are, who your parents were, so on and so forth. So he's making that point here. So we get that point made a few times in in this next chapter, in chapter 8. We get to learn, that the danger is real pretty early on, and that's really important. At the end of chapter 8, we learn that Gringotts Bank had been robbed, that Gringotts is like the safest place in the magical world next to Hogwarts. And so if Gringotts can be broken into, then that lets us know that they are in real danger, even at Hogwarts, which is presumed to be a safe place. So, children have important decisions to make about who they want to be. Harry embodies the courageous aspect that characterizes Gryffindor. Because he enters the wizarding world knowing full well that Voldemort wants him dead and that Voldemort tried to kill him, and yet he's not fearful. He's not even fearful of Professor Snape's inquiries and him berating him in class. That would connote that fear itself is a learned behavior or taught behavior. Confronting fear takes courage. And I would also add this, it takes practice. You have to work up that muscle of practicing good things and bad things. If you do bad things and you do them enough, they become easier to do, right? It becomes easier because you flexed the muscle and now you've created the habit. But if you're in the habit of being good, you're in the habit of doing good, then it's not so hard. It's not so much of a stretch for you to do that, not only for your own soul, but for that of others. And that's what Harry does. Harry puts his own life on the line for his friends, and his friends do the same for him. And it's almost without thought. It's without thought, because this is Harry's chance at a life that's more than living at the Dursleys. And so he desperately needs to be more than that. On page 148, Harry jumps on the broomstick at the challenge of Malfoy. He jumps on it, and in a rush of fierce joy, he realized he'd found something he could do without being taught. And that's really important because if they're all starting off on the ground level, if Hogwarts is the great leveler, this is a really important point because we're told on page 148 that Harry has some natural capability that he's not even aware of yet. On page 149, Harry knew somehow what to do. So we learned that Harry does have some strengths that even Malfoy doesn't have, even though he grew up in the wizarding world. He also learns that this is something like his father. On page 152, Professor McGonagall says, "Your father would have been proud. He was an excellent Quidditch player himself." So again, this is something, fear is something that's learned behavior. This is why in the very beginning, Harry had no qualms about saying the name Voldemort. He just called him by his name because he did not learn the behavior of being fearful. This is yet another reason why Professor Dumbledore, I'm so excited. Professor Dumbledore wanted him to grow up in the Dursleys' household because he wanted him to grow up humble, not fearful. And he thought that if Harry grew up in a wizarding family, he might grow up fearful, learning to fear Voldemort. And Harry is so fit to take Voldemort on because he does not fear him. Confronting enemies takes courage. That's something that we know he's capable of. But confronting one's friends also takes courage. And that is notable because they have to stand up to each other in order to do the right thing here. Looking at some other quotes about courage. C.S. Lewis said, "Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at its testing point." I love that. I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan, guys. So no surprise there. No shocker, right? Yet another brilliant children's author. But courage is not a virtue. It's not one virtue in of itself. It's the form of every virtue at its testing point.